Dr. Lucy Hone, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on my podcast, Head Game. How are you?
Oh, thanks very much, and for inviting me along today. I'm very well, and I'm really looking forward to getting into this conversation, all things resilient mindset, with you, because I think you and I have probably got quite a lot in common.
And I can tell straight away, I can just feel the energy through the screen. What made you want to study resilience? Talk to me about this resilience course that you've done in America.
So, in 2009, when I decided I wanted to take a deeper dive into really understanding the complex dynamics of resilience, there were two places in the world that I could have studied. Actually, at that point, there was only one place, I think, and that was the University of Pennsylvania. And they had a master's program in resilience and wellbeing science. They also, very soon after, one came at UEL, University of East London. But at that point, I was ensconced in New Zealand, so that was just even a bit further commute. So I commuted backwards and forwards over 2009, 2010, went 11 times to Philly.
Wow.
And that was really exciting, amazing time. And for me, it was particularly amazing time because the academic department that I was aligned with had just picked up the contract to create the comprehensive soldier fitness program.
Wow.
To make American soldiers as mentally fit as they have traditionally been physically fit.
Yep.
So it was, for someone like me, as I say, like my only interest is how can we drag the best of findings out of the ivory towers of academia and bring them to people in their everyday lives. Then you don't get a much more discerning, skeptical, cynical audience than those guys who were heading out to Afghanistan at the time. So,
and that program was just starting, was it?
They were literally creating it and training the trainers while I was there. So I came back from Penn and did my PhD out of Auckland and ended up working here in Christchurch because then suddenly we had those earthquakes. So once I came home, I was suddenly really entrenched in helping my own community get back on their feet.
So you come back from your studies fully qualified, in a real good place, obviously. And then talk to me about the Christchurch earthquake, because that was devastating. It killed, I think, 185 people. And obviously the community and the country was just in a state of emergency.
Yeah, it was really devastating, and like I said, I'm English. I have no experience of earthquakes, and to be fair, nor did anybody in Christchurch. And so we had a kind of minor-ish event for the city. It was further more rural in September. And I think we all thought nothing of that particularly. And then on February the 22nd, 2011, at a Tuesday lunchtime, the city was just absolutely hammered by this one very big event. And it was really shallow under the city. And so it ended up bringing down, I think it was I can't remember if it was 75% or 90% of our city buildings in the years afterwards. And the other thing that I think I certainly didn't understand in the immediate aftermath is that you don't just get one event. So we ended up having 10,000 aftershocks in a 2-year period and 5 major events. So it taught me a lot about
and that's
anxiety.
All from the one event, from the one major earthquake. And that was is that sort of like the ripple effect, the aftermath of an earthquake, if you wish?
Not much of a seismologist, but I know enough.
I'm sure you are, Dr. Lucy Hone. I'm sure you are.
So not. But it is pretty normal to get big aftershocks. And that just adds to the whole stress of the recovery and the rebuild, because every time you have another major event, that sets the clock back insurance-wise, and everyone has to put in new insurance claims, apart from the fact that it is harrowing. And I would say that for a 2-year period, we never really went to bed as a family knowing what was going to happen that night. And so that's a lot of stress to deal with, and it just did teach me a lot about communicating the best of science. That by then I was pretty all over the science, but I'm always curious about how you package up these findings in a way that might actually resonate with people. So it was professionally a really steep learning curve. I'd never done any speaking, like public speaking at the time, and we went and did a resilience roadshow around the city, and I worked with everyone from huge construction companies to, Heart Foundation and government agencies and some of the search and rescue. So it was a long time ago now, and the city is a beautiful recovered place. But
can you remember that day, Lucy? Can you remember the day, and can you just talk me through the day and how you reacted to it?
I was working from home, and I'm a mum of 3, and when we live in a seaside community with big steep hills, and the hills came tumbling down. And so the hills were terrifying, and people were killed under boulders that came crashing down from our hills. And so I can see our kids' school, their little primary school from here, and I watched them watching the cliffs collapse in front of them. And it became my job to stay at home with children that got home and other neighbourhood people. And I don't think I would, as a mum, I remember that was kind of my complaint at one point, was that I was just stuck at home. My husband is a builder, I should have explained. So out of the 2 of us, he was probably a bit more useful to the community in those immediate days and hours. So I remember being really frustrated that I couldn't get out and help people more.
I can imagine.
Actually, it was just doing the mothering thing and looking after the kids. And then we all had to be evacuated. I mean, at the point that the tanks came rolling through our village, I remember thinking, it's definitely time to get out of here. And we had no services for, weeks. So we had to go and live somewhere else for a bit. We had 3 families that night. We had 21 people that night. And another night here in a tsunami warning, we've had 60 people and 7 dogs in the house. So, you just do, you learn to muddle your way through. And I think that's a very little understood aspect of resilience, is that it's not all about perfection and strong stoic behaviour. It's about muddling your way through, because my sister lost her home 3 hours north of us in a later event in 2016. And I remember at that point I nearly lost it, because they had the river coming towards them. We already thought they'd lost their home. They'd lost the bridge. There was no access. And at that point, I've lost my daughter, my mum, and my sister was threatened, and I was really losing the plot. And I remember someone sort of saying to me, "Oh, this isn't looking very resilient." And I was like, no, this is absolutely the appropriate response to what is going on in my life right now. And that is all part of resilience.
Yeah, it's finding a way through, over, around, under. It's literally
crawling.
It's survival is resilience, right? You're coping in a way that you're getting through each hour, you're getting through each day, you're getting through each week. And again, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because people do think it's just about being brave there with your chest out and bouncing things off. It's like, no, you've got the rubble on you. You are in the trenches. You are you're still crawling. You're still making small tiny progress. And I always say progress over perfection. In the right direction, even if it's an inch at a time. That ultimately whilst you've got your whole world crumbling around you. And you mentioned your daughter, which we'll talk about in a bit, but that is the epitome of resilience, is realizing that you're still here. You're still breathing, you're still moving forward. You look around you, you use the positive people around you to keep going. And you were one of those positive people during the aftermath, shall we say, of the earthquake, because your skill set certainly came into play then, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there was a moment where I remember saying to my husband, will there ever be a point at which we leave? And he kind of looked at me and laughed and went, you do resilience and I'm a builder. I don't think we're going anywhere for a good 10 years. And where would we go? And it was definitely, it was a revealing time. It was a hugely challenging time. And I learned so much about resilience,
Yeah.
about the community, the collective resilience that, we really are stronger together. And oddly, and it became an amazing time to have my skill set, because whereas previously people weren't very interested in it, and it's quite hard to do wellbeing and resilience training back in 2011.
Yeah.
Everyone thought that was just kind of soft, namby-pamby woo-woo stuff. Suddenly people in this community really got it. They understood how grateful they were to have each other. They understood that you needed to check in on your neighbours, and that whole community resilience I've watched that play out time and again here, and that has been an absolute privilege to see the dynamic processes in action. And I feel pretty lucky to have seen that in terms of my own academic and professional and personal understanding of this really complex topic.
And did it force you to stay in New Zealand and stop traveling? Not the earthquake itself, but did you think, actually I'm needed here? I won't travel. I'll stay here, because again, the aftermath of it. You mentioned the shocks after it. Well, did you just find a sort of need to just stay in New Zealand and say, right, I've got my work cut out here. I'm far from finished. It's far from over. I'm going to stay put for a while.
I think that's really true. I think that is absolutely true, that our community, the greater city, was decimated, and already we've forgotten how bad it was. I watched a movie the other day where they showed you some drone footage of downtown. We couldn't get into downtown Christchurch for nearly 2 years, I think it was.
Oh, wow.
Because they then just dismantled the whole city. And literally this drone footage just showed you what looks like parking lot after parking lot. It was just an empty city with the odd building here and there. And there was a feeling that, we were locked and loaded, and we didn't want to go anywhere, and we wanted to be part of this rebuild. And I also have written about, academically, the post-traumatic growth that I have witnessed in this city that has prepared us better for COVID and better for any other subsequent disasters, because we know what it takes to rely on each other. And because of the earthquakes, our education sector, our health sector had all created much stronger, closer ties, and had wandered out of their silos that so often happens, and there was much more multi-cross government agency work going on, so that when COVID hit, we ended up writing a piece, some research in a big international journal about the post-traumatic growth, and how all that we'd gone through had actually enabled us to set up the systems and infrastructure that enabled us to be more ready and more adaptable when COVID put us into those lockdowns. Really interesting.
Does resilience breed resilience? When you have a community where you see resilience, where you look around and you go, wow, people look at you, they see what you're going through. You look at other people and you see that you're all getting through this and you're pulling through. Does that create resilience within itself?
I think that's a big question, and I think there's pretty complex things going on there. So we know that there are things like social emotional contagion, and we know that means that if everybody's really struggling and high levels of negative emotions, then that actually is pretty contagious.
Yep.
So we know that when you're in that post-disaster recovery period, that what you want from your communities is that Stockdale paradox of realistic optimism or pragmatic optimism. So you want people to be really realistic with what they're up against, but never lose hope that they will get through somehow. And so what I can speak to is that in that post-quake period. I remember being on the building site one day and one of the boys calling the local newspaper, which was called The Press. He said they should rename this D-Press because it was just so depressing. And, his observation was, it's not good for me to read this in the morning when we're all trying to get out there and rebuild the city, and I need some good news. And so I think there is a kind of contagion effect going on. But at the same time, as you say, when you see the incredible agility that our communities were displaying. And I remember that our schools had to site share for a long time. So we lost, I don't know how many, but a third or more of the schools. None of the premises could be used. And so our eldest, who had just started at secondary school, suddenly went right across to the other side of town, where he was at school in the afternoons, I think. I can hardly remember now. So the school basically had, they had Papanui High in there from 7:30 to 1 o'clock, and then my Ed's school went in there at 1:30, and they used the same site in the afternoon. And I remember one day sitting at a zebra crossing watching Papanui High School, I don't know, 1,000 kids go that way, and then 1,500 boys from this other school go in there for the afternoon, and think, that is pretty incredible, isn't it? This is literally the mental and physical agility that resilience requires in action, and was blown away by the tolerance. I remember at one point thinking I should scrap my PhD, which was on wellbeing, psychological well-being, and how do we measure and conceptualize well-being. I remember thinking, I think I should scrap it and study tolerance, because the levels of tolerance and how many times all the roads were dug up for years is just quite staggering, to see that ability of humans to just cope and
adapt,
not complain that much and adapt. Yeah, it was really amazing.
You lost your daughter, and this is a point I really wanted to talk to you about, because I'm a father of 5, and when I read your story, it is every parent's worst nightmare, and it sends shivers down my spine. And just to think about it psychologically, just to think about it for a second, I have to just go no, because I couldn't even fathom, I couldn't even imagine what it's like. So you go through these earthquakes, you're coming out the other end, and then you lose your daughter Abby in 2014 in a car crash. If you could you take me back to that moment, if possible?
Yeah, so you say that it's hard to fathom, and it is for every parent. It is impossible to imagine. And it was an unsuspecting Saturday, and we were all going 3 families to bike a newly opened mountain bike trail. And at the last minute, Abby, who was 12 years old at the time, the phone rang and she said, "Can I go in Ella's car?" So we said, yeah, sure. They were tied at the hip, and we thought nothing of it, and dropped her off at the netball courts. So she went off with Ella, and we were all having dinner later on that night, and Ella's family hadn't turned up, and we, as you do, just assumed they were stuck in traffic or something had happened. But we then got a phone call from a policeman saying he was on his way to see us and there'd been an accident. And as they had driven down through the back country lanes to come and join us, someone had driven through a stop sign at 100 kilometres an hour and crashed into their car and killed Ella's mum, Sally, who was a really great friend of mine, and Ella and Abby. And so, literally the unthinkable is suddenly very much our reality. And I remember the policeman coming, tracking us down in this country lodge, mountain lodge, and distinctly thinking that it was like one of those moments where your life path splits that you never see coming and is completely unfathomable. But and you'll probably appreciate this, Anne, because I can't quite I can't really separate me, the researcher, from me, the mother. And I remember thinking, like almost like an out of body experience, going, whoa, I didn't see that coming. And that is now my life, that we are going to be forced to live down this completely unexpected path and somehow have to survive her loss. And I think the words were, I mean, I only now remember this because I've written about it in my book, but you know, that's your life now, time to sink or swim. And that was my survivor's mission. And you see this a lot in the resilience literature, that people talk about a survivor's mission. And it was crystal clear to me from that very first moment that we were fighting for survival, and I was bloody determined that we would somehow make it through.
And the obvious question, how do you tackle something like that? I know that you said that, you know, you're forced, and when you're forced down a certain road or in a certain direction, then you have to put up or shut up, really. You know, you have to, you can't, you've got no other option. It's a case of, we have to tackle it. How do you even start to tackle something like that?
I think in truth, so I do lots of work nowadays. We run a program called Coping with Loss. And so I spend my life now talking to bereaved people about how they can cope with loss. And so what I'm talking to you about now is partly my own experience and partly what I have seen work with others. And the first thing is that you've somehow got to believe that you're going to get through. And I didn't want to be a victim. And we were told that we were now prime candidates for divorce, mental illness, and family estrangement in that first week. And I remember thinking, whoa, thanks for that. I thought my life was already pretty shit. Can't believe that you're just making it worse for me. And I became very determined to think, okay, that's not happening on my watch. And that's kind of mama bear instinct thing of just going, nah, we're not doing that. I am going to hold my family together, and we're somehow going to get through this. I knew, of course, I had all my training to lean on, and even in those first earliest days and weeks, I was using tools such as really thinking about where I was focusing my attention. And so I had this voice in my head that said, choose life, not death. Don't lose what you have to what you've lost. And we are fortunate enough to have two beautiful sons who were teenagers at the time. And I was really determined to live for them and be there for them, and they needed me right now. You know, we needed to somehow cobble together a family existence that was going to enable us to just get through the days and weeks. All of what I'd learned in the disaster recovery was really helpful. For instance, I knew that it would be helpful to us to create some semblance of a normal routine. And, you know, using the word routine pretty loosely here.
Yeah.
We would get up in the morning and walk the dog and have a cup of coffee, and then, you know, talk to other people, and then have some lunch, and then walk the dogs again, see the kids after school. But getting the kids wanted to go back to school, and I think me knowing that would help them, knowing from my training, that we let them go back.
Trying to lead a sort of semi-normal life without too much disruption. Is that? Yeah.
Mainly functioning was my kind of goal. I remember my husband and I talking about that, saying, you know, we can't control so much of this, but if we just endeavour to kind of mainly function, and if we acknowledge when we can't do that, it's okay to lie on the couch or not get out of bed, then see, there's a lot of self-compassion. And in my, I don't know if you've seen my TED talk, but those are those 3 secrets of resilience. I think these are my kind of 3 sort of tools of resilience. That is self-compassion. You've got to be kind to yourself and let yourself off the hook and lower the bar and do what you can. So that's the first bit. And then this ability to really grow your self-awareness over where you are putting your attention, and then asking yourself, is what I'm doing, the way I'm choosing to think, act, or be, helping or harming me in my quest to get through this? So those were my absolute foundational resilience tools that I had picked up at the University of Pennsylvania that without a doubt came and saved me. So in essence, they are self-compassion. You know that shit happens, and that stops you from feeling discriminated against and singled out. And then you grow your self-awareness to really tune into what is still available to you and the strength and supports that you have got. And then I use that question around helping or harming me to give me some self-control, to put me back in the driver's seat so that I am doing everything I can to survive, taking action, and not just being a passive participant in this journey.
I find a lot of people as well, Lucy, they take things extremely personally when it's out of their control. And I found that with soldiers, and when I talk to veterans that have witnessed, their friends being, blown up in front of them, and they take it terribly personally, as if, that should have been me. Why wasn't it me? And I always say to them, look, listen, it wasn't put, that ID didn't have your name on it. It was just it's just to disrupt and to disturb. And I find that when you take things on personally, and you just said about being kind to yourself, which is I think is key. When you take on things personally, that's when things, because you haven't got the answers to them, right? That's when you start going around in roundabouts. That's when you start, tripping yourself up because there's no answers to taking things on personally. How hard was it not to take things on personally, especially because you mentioned that just saying to your daughter, yeah, jump in that car, is this fine? And there's so many different variables that could have happened, but you can't take it personally, can you? Because I think that's a huge downfall of not being able to process something and eventually sort of not move on but move forward.
Yeah, totally agree. And having my training helped me not take it personally. And my husband said in the police car that night, because they drove us home, and he said, we're not going to blame the driver. And our boys and I all went, yeah, we're all going to agree on that now, because we know that life is random. And that helped us. Like, we didn't do the why me, because we all know that tough times, awful things happen to people all over the world every day, and it's not like people get singled out. And we know that life's not fair. I think these are some of the deeply held core beliefs that came to save us. And I also, that stopped me from doing the what ifs, that I would, knowing that I could kind of corral my attention. I used to have a rule that I'd let myself do 2 what ifs. What if I hadn't let her get in the car that day? What if I hadn't booked the trip away? And then I'd say, seriously, Lucy, is this helping or harming you? It's just you're on a hiding to nowhere. And I would use it all the time, do we want to meet it? We were offered a restorative justice session with the driver afterwards. And I thought, well, will that help me? I've forgiven him. Forgiveness is not condoning. Just pause there and say that for a minute. But I've forgiven him, but do I want to spend time with him? No. Will that help me? No. I'm just said no thanks. But my husband, asking exactly the same question, said, yeah, that will really help me. I want to spend time with him. And I think that speaks to the fact that question really empowers you and puts you in the driver's seat. And I truly believe that we all have to make our own recipe for resilience. We have to work out what works for us. And it changes all the time, it's situational, contextual. So, and it's a very powerful tool to help you with your decision making in those tough moments.
Now, what really interested me about having you on, Lucy, was, I speak to a lot of psychologists and a lot of, resilience coaches, and, they've got all their masters, they've got all their degrees, and they've practiced it, they're the subject matter expert, reading books, etc. But you've lived through both, which I find absolutely fascinating. Does what you've taught, what you've learned, and what you've taken in over the years through your education and through your books, does it sync with the life experience that you had, and how much did that help, having gone through college, uni, etc., and got all these qualifications?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I think it has given me a lot more confidence in the material
Got you.
because I've tested it.
Yeah.
And oddly, because we've all lived through COVID, and like I say, I had to live through 2 years of earthquakes, and then my sister's earthquake where they lost their family home, and then we had that mosque shooting here in 2019, and my brother has died early, very early, mid-50s, to dementia. We've lost Abby. We all have stuff to deal with in life. But I guess I have this kind of bird's eye view, like I'm the drone looking
Yeah,
down,
absolutely.
going, "Oh,
Yeah.
this is so bizarre that actually these ways of thinking, acting, and being, which I might not have been so confident in when I first came out with my newly minted master's degree. Now I'm like, seriously, we don't really understand the genetic makeup of resilience. You can't always influence your environment, but actually, if you are really careful and able to choose how you think and act, you definitely can have a big influence on your lived experience. And it's made me much more, I just feel much more strongly about the material, and it's given me a lot more confidence. And nowadays I've learned so much more about grief, which frankly is a topic that no one knows anything about, really, out in the everyday world. We live in grief awkward, grief illiterate, death phobic societies. And yet, if 76% of people have dealt with a potentially traumatic event, then most people are coping with loss. And I am now just forever fascinated by that, by how we cope with loss and what enables us to adapt in a healthy way while still grieving. And who knew that you could live and grieve at the same time? Because I didn't, but I sure as hell do now.
Yeah, that's what I find it so fascinating, that you've lived through both. You're highly you're highly educated in it, and then you can't talk about living at the top end of it, of resilience, and you say, oh, everyone goes through hard times, but wow. Now fusing the two together, have you come up with new practicings or new ways to deal? Has there been a light bulb moments where a sort of kick yourself moment where you thought, oh, I did understand that, but now I can understand it, and I can really unravel it, unpick it, and enhance it in a way where no one, this is a new practicing. This is a new way, I believe, of dealing with a situation, whether it's grief or compassion, whatever it may be. Fusing the two together, has it given you a little combustion of ideas, shall we say?
So many aha moments, and a really good one I can share with you now is that, like so many people, when Abby died, I knew of the 5 stages of grief. I might have been able to name 3 or 4 of them, that whole kind of bargaining, depression, denial, anger, acceptance model that came from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I remember thinking, this isn't really fitting with my experience. Like, I don't feel angry. I'm not in denial. I've seen my daughter's dead body. I mean, there's no denying that. And I reached acceptance right at the beginning. So that made me curious. And then I went looking for scientific evidence. And turns out, she created that model for people who were anticipating dying. So actually, it's not about grieving whatsoever. It was about the people who were dying, what the stages that they might go through. And then I dug a bit deeper to go, and actually there's very little evidence to show that we go through those stages at all. So instead of that, I then realized that I wanted to be an active participant in my grief process rather than just waiting for this supposed stage theory to happen. And I bumped into, well, I didn't bump into, I found in the research something called oscillation theory, which is so much of a more helpful model, which says that when you're grieving, you've got to do 2 things. You've got to cope with the loss. You've got to cope with the actual bereavement, your misery, the loss And then you also have got to cope with rediscovering and rebuilding a new life. And so what we do is we ebb and flow between these two states. Sometimes we're in what they call the loss oriented stressor. You know, I'm crying, I'm on the couch,
Yeah.
I'm hiding under the duvet. And then at other times, I have to get the kids to school. I've got to get some food on the table. I've got to go and work. I've got to just reapproach life. And what the theory shows is that you don't want to spend too much time in either of these. So you don't want to be sucked into the grief all the time, and you don't want to be avoiding it, getting on with the everyday life, but you actually just want to ebb and flow. And that, I think, is so interesting when you then when you bring that bereavement model back to resilience in a wider perspective and go, this is really true of most challenges, isn't it? That you actually, that you don't need to go at it all the time. You can actually approach it in bite-sized chunks, try and sort this gnarly problem out, and then come back and go, okay, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to go and distract myself with something, you know, ideally a kind of healthy distraction rather than booze. But, you know, find your way to ebb and flow backwards and forwards between the problem. And so we've learned so much about grief that everybody should know. And it appalls me all the time how little everyone knows about grief, when we all need to know this stuff. We all go through it.
And how, I suppose, a question for myself, but also I would imagine from a lot of people, how hard is it to live a positive life or to move on, rebuilding a new life, shall we say, because rebuilding a new life without the guilt taking over, and without, you know, you feeling that, you know, you're rebuilding a new life, you're almost letting go of your old life, i.e., you know, it is how do you manage through that process?
Okay.
You know?
So another great question, Ant, because one of the contemporary grief theories that I rely on, which I basically discovered when I was first grieving Abby, and now we share with our clients all the time, is something called continuing bonds theory. And it suggests that the most healthy way to cope with a loss is to actually work out ways to keep that person close to you and continue to honor them in life, so that you move forward without really feeling like you have left them behind. And so you can do that in like small ways. You know, I've got a little A for Abby on my necklace here, you know, she's always close.
There you go.
But I can, you know, one of my sons is coming home this weekend, and I'll always buy Abby's favorite crisps, you know, to have in the house when he's here. But I'm also building her legacy, and all this work I'm doing on our Coping with Loss program is I've learned all this stuff because of her. And I never would be doing this work if I didn't, if I wasn't lucky enough to have her in my life. And it's amazing how, of course, it doesn't take all the pain away, but it does really make you build a more constructive approach to coping with that grief. And you know that she's forever with us. You know, she's not here, but she will never be forgotten. And we're so glad we had her.
I love that. It's just the small things, you know, the small memories, the small things that there'll always be a topic of conversation for Abby, right? So she's always part and parcel of you know, you guys growing old together and moving on. And talk to me about your TED Talk, because I found that, you know, I could listen to you I could talk to you for ages. Why did you do the TED Talk, and do you enjoy doing them, and does it help you as an individual?
So firstly, I did it because I was asked to do it in 2016, and I said no way. And I was writing my book Resilient Grieving at the time, and I said no, I'm not doing that. And then Kyla, who runs TEDx, came back to me in 2019 and said, look, we're reopening the town hall. You are so much part of the resilient story of this city. You've got to be there when we open the town hall. It's been closed for whatever it was, 9 years. And I remember laughing and saying, seriously, you know how to get me, don't you? So she persuaded me to do it. And then, of course, I'd only done it about 6 months earlier before COVID hit. And I was lucky enough that in that COVID period, it was then put up, elevated, promoted onto the TED.com platform. So it went from a TEDx to a TED Talk. And that meant that suddenly it was helping people all over the world. And it has been incredible. I get literally emails and messages on Insta and LinkedIn or whatever, weekly, from people saying, just watch your TED Talk, or we watched it at work, and it's been really great, to understand the 3 secrets that I talk about of resilient people. But in truth, so I think all of my work helps make sense out of something so senseless. And I also know from all my research into bereavement nowadays that sense making and meaning making is actually the key process that goes on in grief. That is what we're trying to do, is trying to understand how something so awful could happen, and trying to recreate core beliefs and a meaningful world that makes sense to us in the months and years after that loss. So we are deeply meaning making beings, humans. We search for meaning in everything we do.
We're problem solvers,
and I'm
right?
Fascinated by it. Yeah, we are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sense makers, just like, how did this happen? And what, over time, when something so traumatic has happened and you've had all your core beliefs smashed apart, over time you are rebuilding a world that makes sense to you again. And one of the key researchers whose work I love is a guy called Tom Attig, and he talks about relearning to live in the world. And I think that's kind of what it's all about.
Wow. Lucy, before I leave you, one final question. How do you help yourself? I know it can become draining, and I know when you can't help yourself, or you haven't got that support network around you, you can crash and burn. How have you stopped yourself from doing that?
So in truth, having a PhD in wellbeing science and lecturing on burnout prevention helps me.
That's a whole new podcast.
Because you got to, I'm a ruthless prioritizer. So one of my sessions I run is on ruthless prioritization, and I am ruthless.
Love it.
So I
love it.
I really try not to get sucked into all the noise and stuck in the weeds.
Yep.
And then in terms of my own well-being, we've got 2 really annoying Jack Russells, and at about, at the end of the day, they're at our heels and they want to get down to the beach and get out. And I know the social support I need. I've just recently been thinking, you're not doing enough exercise, Lucy. You're not seeing enough of your friends. So just this morning I rejoined a gym and went along with a couple of my mates thinking, it's winter here. You need a top up. You need to get out. And pretending that I'm going to get into our garage gym and do that, and I need to stop fooling myself and join a gym. So it's that self-awareness. You just got to keep it going, haven't you, of what's helping and what's harming you.
You do, Lucy. Well, listen, do 10 squats for me, please. And it's been an absolute pleasure. I honestly could talk to you. It fascinates me. I'm sort of now digging my head into the books, the practical side of, I keep going through, and I keep putting myself in these situations to keep myself resilient and to learn about it. And I'm getting my head in the books now. So you've definitely sparked that within myself. So thank you so much, Lucy. And thank you ever so much for coming on Head Game. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for inviting me, Ant. It's been a pleasure.
You're most welcome.